Welcome to Law and Justice. I'm Jane Mulcahy. This is a special series on the topic of relationships matter. And today I'm joined by Eilidh MacNab from Tusla, and I'm so looking forward to our chat.
Lovely to meet with you.
I'm delighted that you took the time, Eilidh. Can you tell me a little bit about yourself to get started, please, and your background?
Yes, I qualified in 1986 in Edinburgh. And I became a generic social worker. In those days, there was no specialisation. You did everything from cradle to grave. Okay. And then round about the late 80s, specialisation came in and I joined the child protection team and became a child protection social worker, and then became one of Scotland's first joint police social work teams.
Oh, wow.
In central Scotland, and then moved to an out of hours team. And then in 1999, I came to Ireland and became a team leader. And I've been very fortunate in that I've been able to be a team leader, a principal social worker, an area manager, a general manager, and now I'm an interim service director. Okay. So I've had a very varied and very enjoyable career with the public sector in Scotland and in Ireland.
Super. Thanks, Eilidh. So the topic of this series is about relationships and why relationships matter. Why do you think relationships matter, Eilidh, from both your experience in practice as a social worker, but just, I guess, as a human in general?
Well, they're essential. They're really a core element in how we as human beings function. And we identify and emotionally invest in our relationships with our family of origin, friendships and partners and community and work. So on a daily basis, we're invested in relationships. And obviously being a social worker is one of the core elements, the relationship of a human being. And I also know from being a social worker that relationship between social worker and client and child is absolutely essential. And indeed, if you have a relationship whereby there's empathy, there's honesty, there's trust, it has been evidenced in many research things. Certainly, I was in Minnesota before Science of Safety. This was differential response model, and a high percentage of a case success, whatever metrics you wanted to look, whether the child remained at home, continued at school, stopped offending behaviour. A high percentage was down to the relationship there was between the social worker and the child. Okay. So it reflects on our own emotional well-being and our capacity to work collaboratively with others. So it's we certainly within social work, we recognise that children require stable and safe relationships, and attachment. A theory demonstrates the values of relationships, and particularly in a newborn baby, ensuring needs and relationships are met and formed. So, as I said, it's a core principle in social work, and our core role is to promote positive relationships with significant others, so that safety and welfare can be assured. So, it's essential.
Thanks.
Not only my professional role, but in my own personal role.
Sure. And then from your practice experience, you mentioned attachment theory there. How does disorganized attachment, so where a child has a frightened or frightening caregiver, and then and also relational poverty more generally, where they have no one else maybe in their lives to support them and buffer them, how do those two things negatively impact a young child?
Hugely. I mean, relational poverty presents significant challenges for parents who don't have the emotional availability or insight into the needs of their children. And then contributing factors to this may relate to, parental substance abuse, alcohol abuse that they've maybe had in their previous lives, mental health profiles, which results in parents' behaviours causing stress and distress to the child, and their own personal and emotional difficulties that relate to their own past experiences. There's been various studies by Segal, our own clinical team working with children in special care within Ireland, that disorganised attachment is prevalent in many of these backgrounds, and equally is accessibility to relevant services such as speech and language therapy. If the child's own needs aren't met at a very early age, that will undoubtedly lead to detrimental impacts on their later lives.
Eilidh, our constitution has a special provision about the rights of the family, and in fact children were only recognised as independent rights holders following a successful referendum in 2012. When a family is struggling to create a safe, loving, nurturing environment for a child, how do social workers decide when to institute care proceedings? It must be quite a difficult decision, I imagine.
I mean, in the circumstances you described, Jane, it's always a very difficult decision to make. And I mean, fundamentally, I have never met parents who didn't want to do what was best for their child. And as social workers, we want to keep children with their families if at all possible. So in the circumstances you described, the development of primary prevention and family support services, along with their partnership model of signs of safety, puts in place frameworks and structures and services to seek support that children remain in the family home. And the signs of safety and partnership prevention family support, it taps into the family's strengths and insights to these families and community services to come up with a meaningful and effective way of developing support for both parents and their children. So it's really looking at family networks, because most people live in very, very, strong communities where they have networks that can help them through difficult patches. And then active engagement with children is a key element of this process, and the children's views and experiences are shared with parents so that they themselves can work out what they can do to maybe adjust their behaviours to meet their children's needs. So it's a difficult, most children that I would have, sadly had to remove from family homes, the children love their parents, but they want the behaviours to stop so that they can reunite. And often that's certainly the signs of safety model. We look at strengths. The language isn't jargonised. That's one of the things that's very positive about it. And the toolkits that are used, the words and pictures that the children, the social worker can sit with them, with their parents, so that the children's words say what they're worried about, what they're scared about, what works well. And I think that's very powerful when parents see that, as to how their behaviours can impact on their child. And that strength-based approach works very well. So, but again, the partnership prevention family support can, because that's often the very first port of contact that a family would have. But it's never an easy decision to make. But sadly, there are occasions. I mean, there's over 5,000 children in the care of the state currently. It's never an easy decision to make. And it's one whereby we have to evidence that there's significant risk and harm to the child, in cases whereby there's court orders imposed. So as I say, it's always a very distressing situation for the child and the parents.
Sure.
But ultimately, the welfare of the child is paramount.
Yes. I often empathise myself with social workers, especially when there are difficult cases in the media, because having spoken to people who've been in the care system as well, like you rightly say, people never stop loving their parents despite the stress and tension and maybe chaos in the home. But what types of harm might you be looking at? Would it be things like physical abuse and neglect, or sexual abuse? Are those the type of incidences that might end up in childcare proceedings in court, Eilidh?
Yeah, I mean, the variety, Jane, emotional, neglect, physical, sexual. And the emotional is one that's harder to evidence.
Sure.
Because there's no visible signs. The physical abuse and often and even sexual abuse, more than often than not, there isn't evidence of sexual abuse either. So really, then it comes down to the behaviours and how that child's able to, live and go about their daily business if they're in an abusive situation. And, having knowledge of child development is extremely useful, because then you have an idea of what stage a child should be performing. And if you have a child age 6 who's still not toilet trained, who's still not using a fork or a spoon to eat with food, doesn't know what to do with a cup. There's all these triggers and signals which would indicate there's neglect at some level going on. Now, obviously, organically, you have to be able to show that the child doesn't have some organic situation, but generally, the child development is essential in knowing, particularly in cases of emotional and neglect, when care proceedings would commence.
Right.
And that's one thing about the signs of safety, that the frontline social workers on screening and intake are using signs of safety. So therefore, it's going to court's never easy for a parent or child either, and it can be very adversarial. But the purpose of the signs of safety framework is working with parents and children to alleviate what concerns we have, to allow the child return safely to the family home. And the balance of probability of the child being harmed is the level we use for going to court. And there have been occasions whereby judges have not agreed with the evidence produced by Tusla, and the child has been returned home, with safety plans obviously involved. But it's obviously it's very serious and sad when we do have to go to court, but ultimately it's for the child's safety. And what we do hope is that we can reunite child and parents at some stage. But again, sometimes that isn't the case. The adverse childhood experiences, the disorganised attachment, the things that you discussed earlier on, Jane, are sometimes too monumental to allow that healing for a safety for children returned home.
And what happens, Eilidh, within a team, let's say, if you're discussing a child and family and their situation and the strengths, but then also the harm or the risk of harm, and if there are disagreements about the best course of action within a team, how are they resolved? Is the court situation always going to be a last resort, and you'll try and put a safety plan in place if you can? Or how does that all work out?
Well, there's many children who are on voluntary orders, so it's with the consent or agreement with the parents that they would enter voluntary care. So it can be a mixture of both. But if there's a disagreement, I mean, generally the social worker, the social care worker will report into the social work team leader. And if there's a disagreement at that level, it would then be brought to the principal social worker's attention. And the departments now have what's called a complex case forum, whereby they will present their case. They'll use the mapping, which is signs of safety. They'll use a mapping of signs of safety as to what's working well, what we're worried about, what should the next step be. And that forum is chaired by the area manager, and it consists of other managers, principal social workers and team leaders in the department. And there'll then be a consensus as to what the agreement, but equally and importantly, not just consensus, but it's an evidenced consensus as to what the appropriate course of action should be to keep that child safe.
Okay. And then you mentioned earlier the role of prevention, partnership and family support, PPFS, which I know a little bit about. And Bernard Gloucester, the CEO, was telling me that you're in the course of kind of reorganizing a little bit Tusla's work in line with the current strategy. But what is your own understanding of the importance of this strand of work, the preventative focus?
I just want to go back on that last point as well, Jane. Often if there's disagreement in cases, it's not just the social workers and social work and Tusla that would make these decisions. Anybody else involved in that child's life, whether it be, therapist, GP, the teacher, they would be involved in that decision making as well. And particularly for cases that have gone to Child Protection Case Conference, that would be a multidisciplinary decision as to what happens for a child. So just to raise that point. Partnership and prevention family support, it's an integral part of Tusla. I mean, I mentioned earlier on that 9 times, I mean, more often than not, the first point of contact a child and family will have with our department will be through PPFS.
Okay.
And that then is essential, because if they have had an experience whereby there's been respect, there's been trust, there's been positive engagement, that then in a very practical way helps the family to trust Tusla and move on. And there are excellent examples, across the country of initiatives. And I think no more than when COVID hit, and then of course then we had cyber attack, our staff had to be innovative. Mm-hmm. And there were essential visits had to be made. Children, the priorities, as our CEO mentioned, were children in care, children in CPNS, and families whereby domestic violence was an issue. So therefore visits were having to be made to high risk situations. And our partnership prevention family support were also integral in aligning with our child and family services departments, our CIPSEs, in those early stages, delivering essential practical help to families, whether that be food parcels, mm-hmm. whether it be activity packs. So they were, the work done was phenomenal across the whole of Tusla at those periods of time, and remains so. I mean, it's undoubtedly that to achieve best outcomes for children in a timely way, families have to have practical supports, and they have to have, preschool, after-school supports, peer support, counselling, parenting supports, and the active participation of children and their families in making their decisions about supports that they need, rather than us telling them what they think they need. So sure. That whole engagement is pivotal. And it's grown and developed, the interagency working across all support agencies in the community, schools, community groups, and primarily it's to ensure that any child who requires a service, there's no wrong door.
Yes.
And they're diverted to where they need to be. And you mentioned earlier on that you'd met with Bernard Gloucester, our CEO, and our integrated response pathway strategy mm-hmm. Is very much involved in this new change management that we're about to proceed into, because we shouldn't have a situation whereby a family is trying to get help for their child, but they're being shoved from Billy to Jack. Right. They should be able to get to a front door, and then it be identified where do they need to be to get that assistance. And that's what the integrated response pathway is all about. And I mean, it's to identify and resolve challenges and develop sustainable networks for children and their families to overcome whatever adversity or problems that they currently have.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So that the changes to the integrated response is not about diminishing prevention, partnership and family support, but ensuring equality of access, really.
Absolutely, okay. Yeah. That's that whole partnership prevention is integral to the whole process.
So Eilidh, I'm very interested personally in the impact of trauma on neurodevelopment as well as relationships and behavior, and have personally calls for comprehensive training for all frontline workers at various stages, including social workers. Can you tell me, have Tusla social workers received training about the importance of becoming neurodevelopmentally aware and trauma responsive?
Certainly a growing appreciation, Jane, amongst professionals, psychology, psychiatry, therapists and social works on the emergence and value mm-hmm. of neurodevelopment. And it represents a very exciting development. Mm-hmm. There has been training. I know that counties, border counties, obviously given the experiences that border counties have gone through, the effects of trauma. Mm. So there has been training provided there. And there's a recognition within the department that violence and aggression against staff mm-hmm. and how that impacts on the workers' ability to do their job. So there's been a recommendation that there would be training on trauma-informed practice. And I did try and get when that's going to be rolled out, Jane. I wasn't able to. So hopefully if I can get that to you.
But it's in the planning. That's great. Yeah.
It's in the planning, yeah. And we have empowering practitioners to practice. And they have also looked at that platform. So it's in the planning. And certainly I've heard in conversations, even the trauma-informed practice, even for children, I wouldn't have heard it often, but you maybe would have heard things like, what's wrong with that child? Maybe not necessarily from a social worker, but maybe from a parent or a foster carer. What's wrong? And it's rather than what's happened to that child. So there's a difference in the language and the approach as well. So no, I wouldn't say that it's entrenched, but it's been discussed and it's been looked at, and there's plans to bring training in. There's been I know that in various other parts of the country, I know certainly in the Dublin areas, there was a trauma-informed practice to foster carers.
Okay.
And allowing them, understand the trauma that a child may be, displaying in the foster home. And that was very beneficial. Yeah.
Thanks, Eilidh. With the border counties, were you referring to the MACE program that the collaboration?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
I did some collaboration with them, or attended a training myself, which was pretty interesting. And I know that actually one of your social workers in Cork, when I was doing my own PhD, Dr. Maria Lotti, was looking at a trauma-informed intervention for foster carers, which struck me as quite valuable. But with your own experience, with all the frontline experience, do you think this shift might be beneficial?
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely beneficial, because I know we'll probably go on to talk about it later on, Jane, but child protection social work can be very, very stressful. And obviously the retention of staff is a major issue. It's something that we want to enhance. And the acknowledgement that not only are we dealing with our children and families have trauma, but there can be trauma for our staff because of the experiences that they have in their day-to-day business. So no, it's an exciting development. I mean, as I said, the EPI, as we call it, the empowering practitioners, they look into professional knowledge, and they afford us a learning platform on key components of professional practice. And the trauma-informed practice is one of the ones that's being looked at currently.
Okay. Yeah, it strikes me as very beneficial, all right, just relating to secondary traumatic stress and burnout, and, coming into contact on a daily basis with traumatic material, about abuse and neglect, and listening to it, reading through it, sitting in court cases. That must be challenging. And also the fact that social workers can bear the brunt then of anger from families, or, fight responses from parents, or maybe the public. What are you guys doing at the moment to kind of buffer staff in the face of these difficulties, to help them deal with secondary traumatic stress and overwhelm?
Yeah. I mean, the situations that you've described there, Jane, is reality. That's the reality of what workers on a day-to-day basis are doing. And the supervision of a staff member is vital. That relationship, going back to relationships, that relationship they have with their line manager, and that they can discuss what cases are allocated to them. Is it manageable? Is it not? If it's not, what can they do to assist that person? And health and well-being. We have the employee assistance program, whereby it's free of charge. And it's available to all staff. So staff can actually self-refer. They don't require their manager to refer them. And equally, we have occupational health, which is referred by your line manager. So it goes back to the regular practice supervision. Team meetings, I mean, the camaraderie and support you get from your colleagues is vital in the line of work that we do. And we also have, obviously, with COVID over the last 18 months, the face-to-face training has always been available or practical. We can't do it. So an online resource called Empowering Practitioners and Practice Initiative has been there to support social workers, and it provides summary research findings and best practice guidance on how to protect yourself and look after yourself. And many of the teams across the country, in fact, all of the teams, will have staff wellbeing days where it could be they have a coffee morning just to get together, and they have training and discussions on resilience, impact of trauma. So the important thing is that it's actually verbalized, it's talked about, rather than not being talked about. Sure. But it's encouraged to talk, and equally encouraged, when there's been and it doesn't always have to be the most, high profile, difficult case that's actually going to impact on the worker. Sure. Yeah. It can just be the added, day to day, and eventually, something that seems fairly innocuous is the one thing that's enough for the worker to say, do you know what, I need some time out. Yeah. So it's having that honesty and that relationship with staff, that the culture of the organisation is such that they're able to have that discussion and then be assisted to help them with that.
Yeah, that it feels safe and that you're not exposing yourself or be deemed incompetent somehow. Because I think that's a big challenge in a lot of frontline service providers, is that feeling distressed and saying this is too much for me right now can make the worker feel like there's something wrong with them. Whereas really, if you're dealing with this traumatic, stressful material day in, day out, it's actually quite normal for it to have an impact. So it's great that is acknowledged, and that you're working towards constantly improving things. Just on the supervision aspect, is that case management supervision, so talking through the cases and how things are going, or is there also a kind of clinical dimension to that, Eilidh?
There can be. It depends on what caseload the worker has, but equally along that supervision chain, there's also a time whereby it can be, right, okay, that's the practice stuff out the way here now. We need to look at what your annual leave is, right. What's working well, what's worrying you, what training, or what would you like to look at further? What do you feel that you need more training in that? And also, how are you doing?
Yes.
And it's having that conversation, because as you've described there, if you're in a busy team and everybody's going about doing their business, and for whatever reason you feel, actually, I don't think I'm doing that great, you have to have the permission and that culture of openness that you can actually go to people and say, I'm not doing that well, I need to get some help in that. So I think that's something we're certainly, well, going back to the 80s when I qualified, that wouldn't have been part of the conversation at all. But, the recognition of that, it's certainly it's ingrained now in our day-to-day work. And I think the recognition from our own department, our violence, aggression against staff is obviously on our risk registers. So therefore, it is acknowledged. And equally as managers, if there's been a particularly difficult situation, managers would then be phoning their workers outside office hours to say, how are you? I didn't see you today. You had a difficult day. How are things? Yeah.
Again, the relational dimension being
absolutely
important, right? To keep holding people.
Yeah.
Final question, Eilidh, and thank you so much for sharing your time and your wonderful insights from practice with me. What do you believe politicians and policymakers could do to prioritise safe, healthy relationships for all children and also for their caregivers?
Well, irrelevant who the politician and policymakers are, we have our job to do.
Right.
And what we can do is certainly, report in and give reports on what's working well, what needs to change. And that's something that we routinely do with politicians and particular policymakers, our Department of Children, Education, Integration and Youth and Justice. There's very, very close bonds. And, many working groups whereby, for example, the Child Care Act could be looked at, because it was written many years ago. So therefore, how has society changed? How has legislation changed? That that bit works well, that bit doesn't work well. So Yeah, I think that relationship worked quite well. I'm involved I'm leading out in the child abuse substantiation policy, which will replace the old 2014 Section 3, retrospective abuse allegations. And we don't have a legislative basis. We're operating under Section 3, the duty to promote the welfare of children, which has been hugely problematic, and it's been heavily critical in the High Court. There's been various judgments. The Child Rapporteur has made comments. So there is a recognition that in the absence of a legislative basis, Tusla have to do.
Yeah,
we have to, promote the welfare of children. So we're working in that gap. But that isn't for me to jump up and down about. I have a job to do. I have a responsibility, and I accept that responsibility, and that's something that we can do.
Okay. Well, Eilidh MacNab, thank you so much for speaking to me today. I really, really appreciate it, as I say, and I've learned a lot from the conversation, and certainly have personally now a better sense of where Tusla is and where it's hoping to go. So thanks for taking the time.
Jane, thanks very much. I've really enjoyed spending some time with you. Thank you.
So guys, this has been Relationships Matter, a special series of Law and Justice with me, Jane Mulcahy, and my guest today, Eilidh MacNab. Thanks so much, Eilidh.